Let's have a look at some techniques that we would use to identify risks. So one aspect that you would consider is looking at previous projects. So if you've got a historical database, you'd look at what happened in the past, and based on that, you'd figure out what possible risks are likely to occur in the future. If you don't have that option, you'd look at similar projects. So let's say, for instance, you're involved in a $30 million project, and you were asked to clarify the risks that are involved in that project. What you would do is you would look at similar projects in the area, so a project that was constructed in Australia, for instance, with a similar value, and then see what risks were identified for that project or what risks eventuated for that project, and you'd adopt similar risks. You can analyze the characteristics of a present project, and then you do that against a given model. So let's say, for instance, we have a model of borrowing risks. So the risks associated with borrowing costs of money. So you're talking about foreign investment fluctuations. If you've got a model for a particular project, so a decent size project that's constructed last year for a specific amount, and the fluctuation was, let's say 2-3% in terms of the foreign market, the foreign exchange market, that could be adopted as a potential risk for your project if it has similar characteristics. Now, what you need to note is that you have to be creative. So, certain risks you can't identify if you look at past projects, or if you were to look at models that are given for similar projects. So you got to be creative, and by that I mean you have to think outside the box in order to come up with precise risks that are likely to eventuate in your project. Now, an example of a simple risk identification method is the checklist method. It's based on historical reviews. I demonstrate the method over here for you guys based on an example that I adopt. So a risk category is the first column. A technical risk, external risk, management risk, and commercial risk. These are the risk types, if you like, or the risk categories that would be most likely associated with any construction project that you'd be involved in. And then I have another column for subcategory, and that's where I've got, say for instance, for technical risk, scope definition and estimates defined. For external risk, I've got environmental and legislative risks. For management, project management, resourcing, and then for commercial risk, I've got contractual terms, any risk associated with contractual terms, and any risk associated with subcontracts. Let's look at technical risk and in specific scope definition. This is where in this column, in the third column, the example risks, this is where I'd provide a description of the risk. So in my case over here, the scope changes during the project that has been identified as a risk. That's a description of the risk. Another risk associated with scope definition is a redundant scope, and that's likely to be experienced in a lot of projects. So after I've done that, I then assess whether the risk is going to impact my project, and that's done in that final column, yes or no. Once I've completed that process, I would have identified all the risks that are associated with my project. Let's look at another example, and this time the method is referred to as the assumptions analysis method. Now it's based on a current assessment of risk. Again, there's an example for you. In one of the projects, for instance, I created this table, and one of the assumptions was that 4 laborers would rock up on a construction site for concrete pouring of the slab on grade. Now, that's the assumption that I had. Could the assumption in this column, could the assumption prove to be false? There is a possibility in that instance of a project. There was that possibility of the assumption proving false, and that's why I have a yes over here. And then in the third column, if it were false, would it impact the project? And I had a yes. And if I had 2 yeses, a yes in the second column and a yes in the third column, then I'd convert that assumption into a risk. So that's what this second point is talking about. So you'd have the assumption, which is the 4 laborers showing up on a construction site for pouring the slab on grade. It may prove false, leading to an impact, let's say, on one of the objectives of the project. So if I had, budget as an objective, it might impact my budget, or it might impact my time. If I had time as an objective in my project, if I wanted to complete my project in a short period of time, the fact that these resources weren't available, we're going to have an effect on this particular objective. A third type of risk identification method is brainstorming. Now, this is based on creativity, so you have to think outside the box and come up with events that might be associated with risks. So there's an example for you. If I'm pouring concrete, I can identify a number of risks that would be associated with that activity. So weather issues, the pump breaks down, workers arriving late, or an error in drawings, right? And if I want to elaborate further on a particular risk that I have identified, I just branch out of that risk. So in this case, you can see from error in drawings, I've got the wrong location that was provided to me by my structural engineer, say, for example. So these are, three methods that you would adopt: checklist, analyzing your assumptions, and brainstorming. Now, what do we do once we have identified these risks? So you've adopted one of these methods and you've identified your risks. What's the next step? Well, the next step is to produce the output. And the output comes in the form of a risk register. You can see an example of a risk register in front of you over here. The risk register basically identifies the risk, has a risk description, nominates a risk owner for each risk. The causes of each risk from the description would also be listed down, and the effect of each risk on your project objectives would also be described. In this case, we have a very detailed risk register, and you can see it's simply a table, and each column represents one given risk that's been identified based on the risk category and the threat, or whether the risk is an opportunity. So a risk can, of course, as we discussed, be a threat or an opportunity. We also see that, in this particular example, we've got probability and impact. So in that case, it was a scale, I think, from 1 to 5, and probability 1 being, the lowest probability, 5 being the highest probability of that risk taking place. And then you have the impact, again, a scale from 1 to 5, 1 being the lowest impact, 5 being the highest impact. And you can see that the overall risk rating, when we multiply these two together, is pretty low. So that's just an example of how you would construct a risk register.